For those of you who have not been with us up here or have not been with us at FBC, we are in 2 Corinthians, and we've been going straight through 2 Corinthians, verse by verse here. And as we get closer to the end here, I've said, I think already once, maybe a couple times, that these last three chapters, 10, 11, 12, I guess not last three chapters, but this last chunk of chapters here at the end in this section are incredibly sarcastic. And I've been saying that and saying it, and maybe it's been kind of easy to see, maybe it's been not easy for you to see, but this week you need to know, that Paul's being sarcastic. Because if you don't get that Paul's being sarcastic, you'll miss. Or you'll just think that Paul's a jerk, or you'll think that he's a hypocrite, or you'll be like, what? Who is this guy? And why is he so mean to the Corinthian church? So you need to understand that this is Paul at his sarcasm, at his finest. So Terry and Robin are going to be incredibly happy, and Kristen Oglesby is going to be super happy, and and their spouses are going to be like, yes, this is what I have to deal with all the time. Exactly. Two reasons I think he does this. Just before we start, so you can kind of understand what Paul's doing. The first reason he's being sarcastic is because in the chapter right before this, he's just talked about boasting, and he's just said that he thinks the only people who boast in themselves are people who are without understanding. He calls them in chapter 10, verse 12. And then he corrects it, what they're doing, and he attempts to give them a better thing to do in their life. And he says, if you want to boast in the Lord. And so he's about to do the same thing, though. That's kind of the problem that we have in this text today. In chapter 10, he says, if you boast in yourself, that's foolishness. That's ridiculous. That's pointless. That's dumb. But then he turns around and does it in chapter 11. So the question is, why? Why, Paul? Why do the exact same thing that in the last chapter you just said was ridiculous? You just tried to give them an alternative, something else you should do, boast in the Lord instead of yourself. And then why do you turn around in chapter 11 and then do the exact same thing? Why do you give the Corinthians back exactly what they were giving to you when you clearly think it's so foolish? The first reason is sarcasm. Here's the second reason I think Paul does this. He's not quite doing it the same. We'll see that next week. We'll see that his boasting is just a little bit different than their boasting. We'll see that more next week as we read the list of things that he actually gives. But this week, what I want you to see is that Paul may be doing what they're doing. He may be playing their game to get to them, to reach them, to get close enough to them and to get enough respect from them that when he gives them the true gospel, the true Jesus, they'll actually receive it. See, I want to read this to you real quick before we start from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is what I think Paul's doing in this section. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 19, Paul says this, and just listen real quick. Paul says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." He says, "To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law," meaning to those who followed the sacrificial ritual system, I became one who followed the sacrificial ritual system, though he says, though not being myself under the law. So he didn't go and follow the ritualistic sacrificial system thinking this saves me, but he did it because he wanted the Jews to feel like he respected them and their practices so he could share the gospel with them. To those who were under the law, I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, meaning Gentiles, I became as one outside the law. Now listen to what he says next. This is the qualifier that's important. Not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. Meaning I didn't go to immoral people and become immoral. I didn't go to the drunkard and become drunkard so that I could talk to the drunkard and lead him to Christ. Okay, I didn't go to the prostitute and become a prostitute so I could lead this man or woman to Christ. Okay, he's saying I still stayed within the moral boundaries of Christ, but to the Gentile, to the one who is outside the law, I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. He says, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. He says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. So, if you're asking the question, why Paul? Why would you tell them in chapter 10 that boasting in yourself is completely foolish? You should never do it. You should only boast in the Lord, only to turn around in chapter 11 and boast. The reason why is because he's watching the Corinthian church respond to these opposers in Corinth. He's watching them respond to their boasting, and they accept it. It's what they think influences them. And so he's willing to say, look, I think it's foolish. I think it's stupid. I think it's dumb. I think it's not getting us anywhere. But if this is what you accept, well, let me step up to the plate. So that's kind of what's happening in chapter 11 with a whole lot of sarcasm at the same time. So let's start reading in verse 16. And I think you'll be able to see what I'm talking about here. This is Paul playing the Corinthians game in a godly way. Paul says this, I repeat, going back to the beginning of chapter 11, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. Okay, so he's telling his whole audience, listen to me. He's saying, if you think that I'm not a fool, then don't listen to my boasting that I'm about to do and think that I'm a fool, because there's a purpose to it. There's a reason. If you already think I'm a fool, Paul says, well, then just listen to me anyways, because you let every other fool run their mouth and talk and just boast about themselves all day. So if you already think I'm a fool, well, just let me do the same thing that you let them do. See, so he's saying to his whole audience, everyone, listen to me. Do you hear the sarcasm? He says, let me boast a little. And then he's going to go on for the whole rest of chapter 11 and boast. It's not really a little. It's kind of actually a lot. Here's an expanded way to read this verse, which might help us understand a little bit. Here, listen to this. It's the same verse, just someone expanded it a little bit. It says this, once again I appeal to you, let none of you get the idea that I'm a fool when I indulge in some foolish boasting. However, if you do see it that way, at least show me the same tolerance and patience that you would show to a fool, so that I may do a little boasting of my own, just as others do. Verse 17. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Okay. These passages hang people up. He says this twice to the Corinthian church, once in the first letter and once here, where he seems to be saying, Jesus is over there saying that, and I'm Paul over here saying this. And the question becomes really quick, whoa, Paul, why is Jesus saying something over here and Paul saying something over here? And why is it in our scriptures, and why do we follow it like it's the holy word of God? Okay. Generally, when Paul goes off like this, like I'm not speaking like the Lord would, but I'm speaking like a fool would. In the first book, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says something similar to this when he's talking about marriage. And he's going on talking about marriage and who you should be married to and who you should not be married to and whether you should get a divorce and all that kind of stuff. And he says in the middle of the section, he says at the beginning of the section, the Lord says this. And then he says about midway through the section, I say this, not the Lord, but me. And a lot of people have taken those kind of phrases and said, well, that's just Paul's opinion, and we probably just throw it out and not worry about it, and because it's not really talking from God. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, when Jesus was around and he was talking about marriage, there was no believers and unbelievers. There was just, were you Jewish or were you not? Were you Jewish or were you Gentile? But then when Jesus came and he died and resurrected 3 days later, then there was people who believed in Jesus and people who didn't. And so then people found themselves in this situation where they're married to someone and they believe, but the other person doesn't. See, that never happened in Jesus' time, so he didn't have to say anything about it. So then Paul comes along and he's going to the Gentiles now, and some people are being converted and other people are not. And now he's got this issue. Some people are like, well, I'm married to someone who's not a believer, so now what do I do? And then Paul gives instructions about that. But he says, I say, not the Lord, not because God doesn't approve of it, but because Jesus didn't have to say it, but now Paul has to say it. Maybe similar here to what he's saying. Like, Jesus might not have had to deal with this in Jerusalem with the Jews, because maybe people didn't get up in the marketplace and stand on their soapbox and tell everybody how great they were. Maybe this was a Greek thing. In fact, it probably is a Greek thing. They loved to do this. Okay, so now that we're in Corinth and Paul's having to address this issue of boasting, he may just be saying, look, I'm doing this, but Jesus never said anything about this. So I'm going to do it because I think it'll reach them, even though Paul thinks it's completely ridiculous. So don't get caught up on verse 17 thinking that Paul's somehow now talking about something that Jesus wouldn't necessarily approve of. Go to verse 18. Paul says, since many boast according to the flesh, I will boast too. Okay, so here you see clearly Paul's playing their game. He's about to step into their world and play their game, and he's going to do it very strategically. You won't see it really until next week. He's going to do it a little bit differently than them. He's going to start out sounding a whole lot the same as them. He's going to end sounding a whole lot different than them. We'll get more on that next week. Here's how we know in verse 19 that the Corinthians, or these people in Corinth, thought they were super wise. Verse 19 says, for you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. Do you hear the sarcasm? Like, you guys think you're so wise, and yet you sit and let these people talk crazy to you all the time. So if you think me a fool, Paul says, well, then you should gladly bear with me also, since you're so wise. Verse 20 is how we know that these opposers in Corinth are abusive. Paul's talking to the saints in Corinth about what the people who are opposing Paul are doing to him, are doing to them, sorry. They're doing this to the people in Corinth. In verse 20, he says, for you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, which is, I don't know, terrible translation, exalts himself, someone who behaves arrogantly, or strikes you in the face. You might remember a couple weeks ago I said at the beginning of this chapter that Paul's major concern is that they're allowing these people to stand, give them a false gospel, abuse them, take advantage of them. That's what he's concerned about. And he says to them, again, you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you. It's the problem that Paul's having with them, but this is how we know how these people function who are opposed to Paul. They're abusive. They stand in the marketplace, they want to take advantage of people. They stand in the marketplace, they want to be physically abusive. You don't see it like my way? Let me just beat it into you. I'm not really sure why they thought that was a wise thing to listen to, but for whatever reason, that was the way you proved your authority. And then verse 21, last verse we'll cover today, and then I want to talk about how we do this without just turning into a bunch of sarcastic fools. Verse 21 says, to my shame, I must say we were too weak for that. Please tell me, you can at least see the sarcasm in that verse. To my shame, we were too weak to abuse you, Corinthians. We were too weak to take advantage of you. We were so weak that we couldn't even physically abuse you. You see the twist that he's putting on? See, the Corinthians and the people who were in Corinth who were opposing Paul, they wanted Paul to be forceful. They wanted him to be abusive. They wanted him to tear down people. They wanted him to elevate himself. They wanted him to stand up, say how great he was. And he didn't do any of those things. And they called him weak for it. And then he comes around and he's saying, well, I'm sorry I was so weak that I couldn't abuse you. I'm sorry I was so weak that I couldn't take advantage of you. It's just sarcasm at its finest. The question is, we're going to go on in the next week and talk about this laundry list that he's going to go into. about his actual authority, his actual accolades, and he's going to, like I said, do it a little bit differently than the Corinthians do it. But the question is, so if we stop there and we say, okay, Paul's playing the world's game. So what? We just supposed to walk out of here and go be the most sarcastic people on the planet? Like, are we just supposed to walk out and say, like, well, if someone's being sarcastic with you, just dish it back to them, go on, have a nice day, and maybe someday you'll get to share the gospel with them? That's really tough. Probably not smart. We probably need to know a little bit more of what Paul's actually doing, and that's why I described it as Paul's playing the world's game. But he's doing it in a godly way. See, none of Paul's boasting that he's about to do is sinful. He just thinks it's foolish. But if the Corinthians don't think it's foolish, then he's willing to become all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. The question is, are you willing to play the world's game? Not, are you willing to be sarcastic? Okay, if you're sitting in the room and you're like, I'm not a sarcastic person and I hate sarcastic people, then you would love my wife, which is why I have to tone it back a little bit. Any other sarcastic people in the room? Okay, yeah, there's a few of you. I was more sarcastic until I got married, and then I decided that's not such a great idea all the time. The question is, are you willing to play the world's game within boundaries? See, Paul said in 1 Corinthians that to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, meaning I didn't go outside moral boundaries to play the world's game, but I was willing to get in with the world and play with them on their level for the sake of saving some. Which means even if Paul thinks boasting is foolish, even if he thinks it serves no purpose at all, even if he thinks it's probably the dumbest thing he could do, he's standing there thinking, but if it would get to them, I'll do it. Why? Because giving someone or having the opportunity to share with them an eternal truth that will save them, that's Paul's goal. That's his mission. That's what he's driving after. And if he says, if you think that this is what makes me authoritative, and it's within the bounds of following Christ morally, I think it's dumb, but I'm willing to do it. So are you willing to get into the world, play the world's game, do it in a godly way? Are you willing to become all things to all people so that some might be saved? It's hard. I mean, like, throw me in a sarcastic community and I'll thrive, okay? But that's not always what you have. Sometimes you go into work community with people who do things that you're like, I don't know if I really want to do that. But the question is, do you have enough self-control? Do you have enough discernment? Do you have enough understanding to go out with people who normally get drunk and go out, have one drink, have good conversation with them, relationship build, and say, gotta go, see ya. And balance their world with yours. You're going to have to know what this says. Because it's really going to be difficult to get out there and decide what can I do and what can't I do, how much can I look like them and how much can't I look like them if you have no idea what your boundaries are. If you have questions about what can I do as a Christian, what can I not do as a Christian, how should I be living, how should I not be living, you need to find answers to those questions. You need to ask somebody who you know can answer those questions for you. You need to read until you find answers. You need to be disciplined in your study so that you don't walk around walking into a situation going, yeah, I can handle this, I'm going to go share the gospel, and then your life ends up exploding and you look a whole lot more like them than they look like you. It's really dangerous. But if you can do it, you walk that same line that Paul's walking with the Corinthian church, you can find yourself having a whole lot of influence in pulling people towards a gospel that can save them, a true gospel. You don't have to have a seminary degree to do it. A lot of people just think, well, I can't do that. Can you pay attention to people? Listen to what their interests are? Can you actually care about what they care about? Some of you are like, well, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. Yes and no. Sometimes people, they just need this much interest. A lot of people, they just want to know that you care or that you're actually paying attention. If you feel like you're a slave to other people, you feel like people take advantage of you, you feel like maybe even people are physically disrespecting you, you don't have to spend your life being torn as a Christian. What should I do? You can learn. This book will tell you, how do I respond to my enemy? How do I live in the world and be a part of the world? The reality is I talk about it like I want you to go into the world and live with them and be willing to transform your life for the sake of sharing the gospel, and even if some would come. But reality is we all live in the world. There's no like, oh, you got to, like, I've been living over here doing this, but now I'm going to go into the world. Like, no, everybody is already involved in the world. So it's not like you got to go it's not like you have to go out and find someone to minister. You have neighbors. You live in a community. Or do you go shopping in your area? Your kids have school teachers. Like, you have all that you need as far as ground for sharing the gospel. The question is, are you willing to know people? Some of you were downstairs when I preached at the very end of chapter 10. If you weren't, I said something like this. There was two issues happening in the Corinthian church that Paul is addressing in chapter 10. The first one is the boasting on the outside. But he actually cuts to the heart of the issue at the very end of chapter 10 when he says, "For it is not the one who commends himself," that's the boasting, "who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends." And he brings in this internal aspect of what's happening in the Corinthians. See, they're outwardly boasting, but inside they want approval. They're outwardly coming out here telling you how great they are, how wonderful I am, this is so great, and I'm so great, because inside they want approval. And we've seen this before. It's the kid who has parents who have never told them they've done anything good ever in their life. And when you're around them, they want to tell you how great they are and how many things they can do and how great they can do them and how much better they are than some other kid. Why? Because they want desperately someone to tell them that they're doing a good job. They want the approval. See, Paul's seeing the same thing happening in the Corinthian church. But you're going to have to get close enough to people to know what's going on the outside and what's going on the inside. Because you can't become all things to all people if you have no idea who those people are. Parents, you know this. You know this already. How come dads dress up in dresses and drink tea with their girls? Because that's what they like. That's what they want to do. And how do you get influence? And how do you sit there and love on them without becoming what they want? Is there anything sinful about putting on a dress and drinking tea with your little girl? No. Does it seem a little bit foolish? Yeah, maybe. But then when you think about it, it's like, well, it's not. It's kind of similar to what Paul's doing here. I think in his heart of hearts, he's thinking this is completely ridiculous. But then at the same time, he's thinking, but if it reaches some people, I'll do it. It's the same for moms who hate football. And then their kid grows up and they want to play football. And they're like, oh, I hate football. But I'm going to go. And maybe I'll even learn a few things about football. Even though I think football's dumb. I mean, there's just a bunch of people hitting each other. And like, you can't. In your mind, it's like, that's foolish. And yet you're willing to say, yeah, okay, I'll do that. Here's one maybe some parents struggle with. that a lot of kids like today, video games. Some parents are like, you just go over there, you play your video games, you have 30 minutes, and then I want to see you afterwards, and we'll talk about something real life instead of those dumb video games. But what your kid loves is video games. Ian's sitting back there like, yes, thank you, preacher, finally. Are you willing to become all things to all people? Are you willing to play the world's game, but do it in a godly way? Even if what they do borderlines on abusive, are you able to take that, transform it, and do it in a way that's not abusive? That's the goal. You'll see it more next week when we go through his laundry list. But what I want you to think about over the next week, 2 weeks, months, am I willing to do all things? Am I willing to become all things to all people within bounds of morality for the sake of the gospel, so that some, not all, might come to know Jesus? Pray with me. God, we know that the Apostle Paul, he had this crazy calling on his life to be a missionary to the Gentiles, and chances are a lot of us in this room won't be called the same way that Paul was called. And becoming all things to all people won't be realistic for us because that's not what you've called us to. But God, would you teach us how to become what the people around us in our life need? Our friends, our neighbors, our family. Would you help us to see their interests, even if we think they're foolish, as a way to reach them, as a way to step out to get to know them? God, would you show us not just what's going on the outside with people, but would you show us what's going on the inside so that we can be effective when we share the gospel, so that we're not just giving somebody something at a time that they don't need it, or they just need comfort, or they just need someone to sit there and be with them. God, would you make us wise to see the opportunities to share the true Jesus, true gospel with the people around us? Would you open our mind, open our eyes to the world around us? And God, thanks for the people who you have called, like the Webbs, to a world that doesn't know you at all. God, I pray that you would continue to teach them how to become all things to all people within the bounds of your morality. Give them a whole lot of discernment, a whole lot of wisdom. God, teach us and lead us and guide us. In Jesus' name.